They came before the plow, before the sword, before names carved into stone. Long before the concept of Europe existed, there were people in the dense forests and cold rivers east of the Baltic Sea. People who hunted silently beneath the snow-heavy pines, who fished beneath the ice, and who buried their dead with flint blades, amber beads, and red ochre smeared across the bones. Their world was one of endurance, ritual, and raw survival. And unlike most early peoples of Europe, these hunter-gatherers never vanished. As the glaciers melted, humans moved northward, following rivers carved by ice and time. In most parts of Europe, these hunter-gatherers were gradually absorbed, replaced, by new arrivals from the south, Neolithic farmers from Anatolia, carrying wheat, sheep, and a new way of life. They brought not only agriculture, but their genes, diluting the ancient ancestry of the continent. But something different happened in the Baltics. Here, the old blood remained. Genome-wide studies of ancient remains from Latvia and Lithuania reveal a remarkable genetic continuity, stretching from the Mesolithic through the Neolithic. While Central Europe was transformed by wave after wave of incoming ancestry, the people of the Eastern Baltic simply persisted. Their DNA tells a story untouched by the farming migrations that reshaped nearly every corner of Europe. This isn't speculation. It's science, written in sequences of ACG, passed down through thousands of years of breath, bone, and blood. Modern Latvians and Lithuanians still carry among the highest levels of Western hunter-gatherer ancestry on the continent, up to 50% in some genetic models. That's not a historical footnote. It's a living legacy, a whisper from a world 8,000 years gone, echoing in the cheekbones and chromosomes of today's Baltic peoples. But why? Why here, of all places, did the old genes survive? The answer lies in a quiet rebellion, geographic, cultural, and genetic. This region, dense with forest and ringed by marshland, acted as a fortress against intrusion. Farming didn't arrive with conquest. It arrived cautiously, centuries late, and without the usual carriers of Anatolian DNA. The hunter-gatherers here didn't vanish. They adapted. They adopted the tools of agriculture on their own terms, but kept their blood pure. In the story of Europe, the Baltic region is a paradox. It is both old and untouched, a biological museum sealed by forest and frost. The genes that built stone circles in Lithuania, that carved amber jewelry in Latvia, that worshipped sky gods long before Rome, those genes are still here, and they speak to us through the double helix, reminding us that not all change is surrender. Some memories are etched so deep, even time can't erase them. The rest of Europe fell under a silent invasion. No armies, no battles, just seeds. From Anatolia, farmers marched silently with baskets of grain and a genetic signature that redrew the continent's bloodlines. They brought plows that split ancient soils and genes that overwrote entire civilizations. Everywhere they went, the old bloodlines faded, except here. In the Baltics, something extraordinary happened. Farming arrived, but the farmers did not. While Central Europe's DNA was rewritten by incoming populations from the Near East, the Eastern Baltic lands witnessed a cultural revolution without a biological one. The tools of agriculture, ceramic vessels, sickle blades, grinding stones, appear in the archaeological record. But the people behind them? They were not newcomers. They were the descendants of the original Mesolithic inhabitants, untouched by Anatolian genes. This wasn't a peaceful takeover. It wasn't even a migration. It was a conversation between worlds. The hunter-gatherers of the Baltic didn't resist the idea of farming. They simply reshaped it in their own image. They planted fields without surrendering their language. They built villages without opening the gates to foreign DNA. The Neolithic came like a whisper, not a storm. Genetic studies confirm it. Ancient genomes from Neolithic-era Baltic individuals show a complete absence of Near Eastern ancestry. While their European neighbors were blending and transforming, these people stood genetically still, firm in identity, yet open to innovation. Theirs was a quiet mastery, absorbing new practices while preserving old blood. Picture this, a Narva pot, crafted with the elegance of an artist, but shaped by a people who still hunted elk in deep forest. A grain of wheat, planted by someone whose ancestors chased mammoths across frozen marshland. This was not a replacement. It was a merger of mind and memory, without the exchange of bodies. The farming revolution in the Baltics is perhaps the greatest anomaly in European prehistory. Every textbook would predict sweeping genetic change. But here, the script flips. The same faces who fished the Baltic coasts now tended rye fields. Their children grew up with stone sickles, but also with stories passed down by hunter ancestors, unchanged by foreign tongues. This makes the Baltic story one of resilience, but also of choice. They chose which parts of the future to accept, and which parts to leave at the border of the forest. In doing so, they didn't just survive history. They rewrote it. They didn't walk. They rode. Across the endless grasslands of the Pontic-Caspian steppe came a people with wheels beneath them, fire in their rituals, and a sky god language no one in the Baltic had heard before. They arrived not in silence, but in the thundering rhythm of hooves, driven by cattle, guided by sun, and carrying a legacy in their bones that would ripple through time. It was around 3000 BCE when the horizon shifted for the Baltic world. A new genetic thread entered, foreign, potent, and fast-moving. The bearers of this thread were steppe pastoralists. Their culture would become known as corded ware, but long before archaeologists named them, their presence was already altering the landscape. Their way of life was radically different. They buried their dead in individual graves, marked with corded pottery and stone battle axes. But their real weapon was inheritance, the kind etched into DNA. They brought with them what scientists now call Yamna-related ancestry, a genetic marker linked to the explosion of Indo-European languages. It came hand in hand with a mutation that allowed adults to digest milk, an ability nearly absent in the earlier hunter-gatherers. It brought lighter skin, a different facial structure, and perhaps even shifts in cognitive traits. But most crucially, it brought change that left a permanent mark. In most of Europe, these steppe genes spread like wildfire, consuming local lineages. But the Baltics, once again, responded differently. They didn't vanish into this new culture. They didn't dissolve. They adapted on their own terms. Instead of being replaced, they absorbed. Y chromosome haplogroup R1a, particularly its subclade M558, took hold among the men of what we now call Latvia and Lithuania. Yet this was not a passive transmission, it was fusion, a unique blending that preserved older maternal lineages, while integrating a paternal line that pointed back to the steppes. The result was neither fully local nor fully foreign. It was something new, something Baltic, and within this transformation, a new balance emerged. The rituals changed. The gods may have changed, but the connection to land, to forest, to river remained. The steppe riders brought speed. The Baltic soul added depth. This moment was not just genetic, it was mythic. A crossroad between two worlds, one rooted in the ancient forest, the other galloping across the plains. From that collision, a lineage was born that would carry both silence and storm within its blood. In a quiet lab in the heart of Riga, a drop of blood was about to whisper a 5,000-year-old secret. It began with a question scientists couldn't ignore. Why did certain blood reactions in Baltic populations defy expected patterns? The answer emerged slowly, base pair by base pair, until it took the form of a gene, a silent signature hiding in plain sight. Its name? LWB. This wasn't just a genetic variant. It was a relic, a rare marker found in 6% of Latvians, slightly less in Lithuanians, and barely detectable outside the region. In Western Europe, it hovers near zero. In Asia and Africa, it vanishes entirely. This wasn't just a mutation, it was a border, a line etched into biology that said, here begins the Baltic. The LWB gene is thought to have emerged from a single-point mutation thousands of years ago, a whisper in the genome that never shouted loud enough to conquer continents, but never faded either. It endured, not because it spread, but because it stayed. It clung to the bloodlines of people who rarely left and rarely allowed others in. Through plagues, wars, empires, and exile, the LWB marker held firm like an ancestral signature sealed in amber. Geneticists call it codominant, a trait that shows itself when inherited from either parent. But in the Baltic story, it becomes something more, a biological watermark, a quiet testament to historical isolation, resilience, and identity. What makes it even more compelling is its distribution. The gene declines predictably as one moves away from the Baltic heartland, like a stone dropped in still water. In Estonia, it's still visible. In Finland, it fades. In Poland, a faint ripple remains. Beyond that, silence. It's the kind of discovery that doesn't rewrite history. It confirms it. That the people of the Baltics have carried something ancient, something rare, something theirs alone. Not in flag or language or legend, but in blood. And what's most haunting? This gene does nothing dramatic. It doesn't grant power. It doesn't dictate survival. It simply exists. A reminder that uniqueness isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, invisible, waiting under a microscope to tell a story older than writing. The wind that brushes across the Baltic today carries more than salt and pine. Hidden within it is a colder breath from farther east, from a land where the winters are longer and the silence heavier. This is not the story of conquest. It's the story of a whisper, traced in DNA, not drawn in blood. Thousands of years ago, long after the last ice retreated but before kings and cities, people from the deep northeast began to move. They came not in vast numbers, but like the slow advance of permafrost, gradual, enduring, quiet. These were the ancestors of the Uralic speakers, carrying with them more than language. In their bones, they brought the genetic signature of the Siberian wilds. What they left behind is not carved in stone, but inscribed in chromosomes. One of the clearest signs is the Y chromosome haplogroup, known as N1C. This lineage does not stretch back to the Near East or the steppes. It reaches into the forests beyond the Urals, deep into the gene pools of reindeer herders and taiga nomads. And yet here it is, prominent in modern Estonians, significant in Latvians and Lithuanians. But like all things Baltic, the pattern isn't simple. It's distinct. The Baltic branches of N1C show variations not found in their Finnish cousins or Siberian relatives. This was not a single wave. It was a mingling, a multi-layered encounter where the East left fingerprints, not footsteps. The genetic legacy of these Siberian threads is quiet but consequential. Alongside N1C came subtle changes, linguistic cues, cultural whispers, possibly even adaptations to northern light and diet. In Estonia, it contributed to a gene pool already shaped by hunter-gatherers and steppe riders, layering yet another dimension of uniqueness into the Baltic genetic code. This wasn't a takeover. There are no signs of mass burial disruptions, no collapse of earlier populations. Instead, it was emerging, people meeting in marshlands and trading across frozen rivers. A hybrid identity formed not through conquest but coexistence. Even today, the Uralic connection lingers not just in DNA, but in language. Estonian and Finnish belong to a linguistic family born from this eastern flow. But the genetic imprint stretches further, even where the words have faded. The Siberian thread is not loud. It doesn't demand attention, but it runs strong and deep, like a cold current beneath warm coastal waters. It reminds us that the story of the Baltics is not just north and south, or east and west. It's all directions at once. A place where genes from the farthest reaches of Eurasia found a home. Not by force, by fusion. The Baltic is not just a place on a map. It's a fortress sculpted by nature itself. While the rest of Europe opened like a field, inviting the march of migrations, the Baltics remained cloaked in defenses not built by men, but by terrain. Towering pine forests, glacial marshes, tangled river deltas, and brutal winters created not only hardship, but protection. This wasn't just landscape. It was insulation, a living wall against the tides of change. Where flat plains led to cultural erasure in other regions, the Baltics resisted. Here, movement was slower. Access was narrow. Trade routes came late, and armies often stopped short, not because of resistance on the battlefield, but because of resistance in the soil itself. The very land seemed to conspire to preserve what lay within, and what it preserved was identity. For thousands of years, while wave after wave of newcomers reshaped Europe's genetic foundation, the people of the Baltics remained anchored in place, not by force, but by choice, and by forest. Their DNA reflects this anchorage, the persistence of ancient haplogroups, the survival of unique genetic markers, the remarkable continuity of ancestral lineages across millennia. The land didn't just keep outsiders out, it kept memory in. This geographical seclusion had a price. Farming arrived late. Technological innovation moved slowly. But in return, the genetic code of these people remained untangled, unaltered by the sweeping admixtures that defined other regions. Even in the Iron Age, when empires cast long shadows, the Baltics remained semi-peripheral. Roman roads never reached these northern woods. Slavic expansion slowed at their borders. Germanic crusaders came, but even they could not erase what the rivers had protected. What survived wasn't just blood, but worldview, custom, and language. This natural isolation shaped more than genes. It shaped thinking. A people hemmed in by trees see the world differently than those born of empire. Their myths echo with earth spirits and lake deities, not marble gods. Their calendars follow the rhythm of birch and snow, not coin and column. And even now, satellite images show what ancient scouts once feared: thick terrain that resists division, confounds movement, and shields identity. Geneticists call this population structure. But here, it's something deeper. It's the echo of a time when distance wasn't measured in miles, but in resistance. In the Baltic, geography didn't just define borders. It defined bloodlines. When we look at a modern Latvian child or an elderly Lithuanian, we aren't just seeing the present. We're staring directly into the eyes of deep time. In their DNA, the past isn't buried. It breathes. Across Europe, the story of genetics is one of layering. Old cultures buried by newer ones, each generation overwriting the last like ink over parchment. But in the Baltics, the pages turn slower, and much of the original script remains intact. What science calls ancestral continuity, the human heart might simply call memory. Genome-wide studies of Baltic populations reveal a blend so distinct it refuses to conform. It doesn't match the typical European genetic template. It bends the rules. Roughly one-third of their genetic code traces directly back to ancient Western hunter-gatherers, people who stalked elk through the forests when Britain was still part of mainland Europe. Another large portion comes from steppe nomads whose influence reshaped Europe's language and culture. But tucked within this blend is something else. A faint signature. A hint of Siberian ancestry. Delicate yet unmistakable. This combination, hunter, horseman, and high-latitude survivor, creates a genomic mosaic that has no twin. Nowhere else in Europe does this precise admixture exist. It's as if nature selected this region to preserve the story, while the rest of the continent evolved past the plot. And what's more staggering is not the data, but its continuity. The patterns seen in ancient remains from 5,000 years ago still echo in modern Baltic genomes. This isn't just ancient ancestry, it's living ancestry. The genes weren't diluted or forgotten. They were passed faithfully, from firelit villages to electric cities. This makes the Baltic peoples not just a population, but a phenomenon. A human archive walking among us. A preserved record of who we once were, and perhaps, who we still are beneath the surface. No museum holds what they carry. No scroll preserves it better. Every strand of their DNA is a footnote to prehistory. A living fossil, not trapped in stone, but laughing, loving, remembering. Across Northern Europe, borders shift. Empires rise and fall. Languages blur. But in the Baltic, something held firm. To the west lie the Germanic tribes. To the east, the vast web of Slavic nations. To the north, the Uralic echoes of Finland. But the Baltic peoples, Latvians, Lithuanians, and to a distinct extent, Estonians, do not perfectly belong to any of them. Their DNA is proof of that defiance. When scientists map genetic relationships across Europe, they find clusters, groupings of populations that reflect shared ancestry. Slavs with Slavs, Scandinavians with Scandinavians. But Baltics? They form their own constellation. Not halfway between neighbors. Not a blend. A separate branch. Take haplogroup R1a, for example. Common in both Slavs and Balts, yes. But look closer. The subclades diverge. What a Russian carries is not what pulses in a Lithuanian's blood. The same tree, different limb. Same origin, different journey. And then there's haplogroup N1c, shared with Finnic speakers, but mutated along a separate evolutionary route within Baltic populations. It's the same melody played in a different key. Even in phenotype, subtle differences emerge. Genetic traits that influence facial structure, pigmentation, and even immunity follow a rhythm in the Baltics that doesn't quite match those of their geographic neighbors. Like a song written in a familiar language, but with verses no outsider can quite translate. This isn't about superiority. It's about specificity. Baltic DNA is not a melting pot. It's a distilled essence, formed by choice, geography, and time. The languages they speak carry echoes of Indo-European roots, but older, more conservative, like linguistic amber. The beliefs they once held, before foreign religions took root, were nature-bound, animistic, woven with rituals that still echo in folk dances and forest festivals. The body and the belief system aligned, carved by the same environment. And so, when we call them Baltic, we are not assigning them to a space on a map. We are naming a lineage, one that has stood at the edge of influence and yet remained wholly itself, neither absorbed nor erased. They are not the diluted reflection of someone else's past. They are their own origin. In the silent spaces between generations, change doesn't always roar. Sometimes it drifts. The Baltics tell a story not only of origin, but of preservation. And preservation has a price: isolation, resistance, and above all, patience. While other European populations shifted under the weight of migrations and demographic floods, the Baltics changed in smaller, quieter ways. These weren't revolutions. They were refinements. One of the invisible forces sculpting this region's genetic landscape is something called genetic drift, a phenomenon where certain traits become more common not through advantage, but through chance. In small populations, drift becomes powerful. A single variant passed down by one ancestor can, over centuries, define a people. In Latvia and Lithuania, this drift locked in rare alleles, traits that might have vanished elsewhere, but found shelter here. Some of them affect immunity. Others influence pigmentation, metabolism, or blood group distribution. They're not dramatic. They're not obvious. But they're profound in their persistence. And then, parallel to this biological narrowing, ran a cultural one. Stubbornness, not as defiance, but as identity. The refusal to abandon language when it became inconvenient. The preservation of rituals long after they'd stopped being fashionable. The choice to remain distinct when assimilation was the easier path. Empires came, borders redrew themselves, and yet the song stayed the same. The folktales, whispered by firelight, still spoke of thunder gods and sacred groves. The calendars still followed solstices, not saints. Even under occupation, the core resisted erosion. This cultural endurance wasn't a coincidence. It was survival strategy. In a region where the climate was harsh and the soil unforgiving, the greatest strength wasn't dominance, it was continuity. If the genes refused to dilute, the stories refused to fade. Together, drift and stubbornness wove a pattern unlike any in Europe. It's a pattern that doesn't just appear in spreadsheets and scatter plots. It shows up in eyes, in names, and how the wind carries the vowels of old dialects. It's a resistance not born from war, but from memory. And in that memory lies the secret. The Baltics didn't remain unique by accident. They chose it, in blood and in belief.